Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here today. It's an honor to be joined by so many of you whose work we greatly admire. We'd also like to extend a warm welcome to those joining us through YouTube from all over the world. My name is Holly Johnson, and I'm the Associate Director of Columbia Global Freedom of Expression. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, Global Freedom of Expression was established in 2014 by Columbia University President Lisi Bollinger to bring together judges, lawyers, journalists, scholars, and activists to advance understanding of international norms that protect freedom of expression and the free flow of information in an interconnected global community. To achieve its mission, Global Freedom of Expression undertakes research and policy projects, organizes events, and contributes to global debates on the protection of freedom of expression. Our flagship project is a comprehensive database of legal decisions related to freedom of expression, which currently hosts more than 2,000 briefs on court decisions from more than 130 countries. Versions of the database are also available in Spanish, Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Russian. Our database helps to identify patterns and trends and monitor developments and inform judicial decisions and advocacy efforts aimed at protecting and promoting freedom of expression. Over the last years, we've also launched a special collection paper series summarizing our jurisprudence in 15 thematic areas of central importance for the defense of freedom of expression globally, ranging from the right to protest to the right to be forgotten. These papers are designed to promote the right to freedom of expression in judicial decision-making and to support strategic litigation in freedom of expression cases. So today we are really happy and honored to co-host this important event, Weaponizing the Law, Attacks on Media Freedom, findings and discussions with guest experts on salient points and solutions with strategic partners, Reuters Foundation, and Tao Center for Digital Journalism in commemoration of World Press Freedom Day. As you all know, in 1993, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed May 3rd as World Press Freedom Day, with the idea of promoting press freedom throughout the world by recognizing that a free, pluralistic, and independent press is an essential component of any democratic society. This year, we celebrate the 30th anniversary of World Press Freedom Day, which gives us a unique opportunity to discuss how freedom of expression is one of the best ways to defend other rights and to protect democracy and as an antidote against censorship, autocracy, and authoritarian governments. This day and the whole week of side events being celebrated all over New York City and around the world represents an opportunity for journalists, scholars, governments, international organizations, and civil society to come together to reflect on the state of freedom of expression. Today, we're going to discuss the key findings of the recently launched research titled Weaponizing the Law, Attacks on Press Freedom by the Tao Center for Digital Journalism and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. This report is an in-depth recent investigation by media law experts and journalists from different regions of the world that provides a global view of threats to press freedom. In a nutshell, the report addresses the very serious phenomenon and pressing problem of criminalization of media professionals to suppress scrutiny and the right to inform. Based on the report's main lines of investigation, we will have a high-level discussion that will focus on identifying future research and data collection needed to further map the scale, nature, and the geographic scope of these threats and how they affect journalists and the media ecosystem. This continued exploration of global trends will be critical for advocacy groups, the legal community, democratic governments, intergovernmental organizations, and journalists themselves to address and counter these threats. So I welcome Antonio, Carlos, Joel, and Carolina, and we very much look forward to the discussion. And so finally, I guess just one bit, we're going to have questions taken in the chat, and we encourage everyone to join us that way. And then you can also engage with us on Twitter. And the hashtag is hashtag World Press Freedom Day. And you can also follow us at Columbia GFOE. So, thank you. Okay, last bit of housekeeping. Now we can start.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Antonio Zappulla here. I'm the CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. For those of you who don't know Thomson Reuters Foundation, we work around the world to strengthen free, fair, and informed societies. And one of the key areas of our work is media freedom. And within the media freedom portfolio, one of the areas that is particularly of interest to us and where we bring expertise is really the intersection between the media and the law. And so the way the law can be used to advance media freedom, protect media freedom, or also to actually hamper media freedom. We just came back from Perugia, where we launched this report last week. And one of the reflections that I was actually making, talking to Joel and to my team, was that last year, when we went to Perugia to talk about legal threats to journalists, there was only one panel in the entire program. And at Perugia, there's about 500 speakers. It's a quite big event for those of you who haven't attended before. But this year, we presented the report, and there were 5 panels across the entire program on legal threats to journalists and journalism. So clearly something is happening. It's good news that this issue is being discussed more widely, because obviously it's not an issue. It's not an issue within our community, but most importantly, should be perceived as a global issue and as a global threat by consumers, by policymakers, and by the donor community. So we are very pleased to be presenting the findings of this report and looking forward to the conversation that will follow.
Well, Antonio, Holly, thank you so much. I want to recognize Carla Claria, my co-author, who's here with me. We also had a very significant contribution from Ona Flores, who's another one of our co-authors. Unfortunately, Ona had a conflict today and couldn't be with us, but I do want to recognize and acknowledge her contribution. We prepared a slide deck that we will be sharing with you and I'm going to be asking Holly to help me with that. And before we jump in, let me just frame what we're going to be talking about a little bit and how this report came about. For 15 years, I was the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and started in 2006 to 2021. And one of the things that we noted during that entire period was year after year, the number of journalists in prison went up. And so that was a clear indication that legal threats were mounting, something we at CPJ recognized. But we also recognized that we were only capturing a small sort of cross-section of the problem, because these were the journalists who ended up in jail. And we didn't really have great data on the number of legal threats per se, and the way in which those threats were affecting the community of journalists that were trying to report on critical issues around the world. And so during my fellowship year after I left CPJ, I spent a year here at Columbia at the Tao Center and also at the Knight Institute, and also worked closely with Holly and Catalina Botero at Columbia Global Freedom of Expression. And I saw an opportunity to really kind of delve more deeply into this issue. Fortunately, Antonio had similar concerns and approached me and said, so this is something that he'd been observing, and could we team up the Thomson Reuters Foundation and the Tao Center to do this research? And that was really the origins of it. So we started the research with an understanding that these threats were mounting, that journalists were aware of it, that the legal community was aware of it, but that there had been no comprehensive effort to catalog, categorize, and prioritize these threats. And we also understood the function of this exercise was to really provide a framework. We saw this as a way of kind of activating the advocacy community, policymakers, the legal community, and orienting them around the priorities. So that was our goal when we first conceived this report, and we certainly hope that this discussion contributes to that effort overall. So let's start the slide deck. Okay. Yeah, this is technology, no problem. The rule with technology, which is depends on the context, but usually in this case, it's a 30-second rule. Everything works. Just give it 30 seconds. In some context, it could be as much as 15 minutes. So, but it always ends up working. All right, so let's just dive right in. Go ahead, you can go to the next slide, Holly. So this is really what I just explained. This is why we did the report. So I pretty much covered this slide, but the leading thing was just a staggering number of journalists in prison around the world. That's a number that's continued to mount. And I want to say just one more thing about what we saw as the impetus for the rising number of journalists in prison around the world when I was at CPJ, and that was the low point was actually in 2000, right before the onset of the war on terror, when there were 81 journalists in prison around the world. Then the following year, after the war on terror began, we saw that number rise to 112. We saw the kind of anti-terror framework being adopted by repressive governments around the world to justify their repressive action. We saw another surge and wave of repressive action linked to the Arab Spring and the color revolutions, when authoritarian governments recognized the threat represented by independent information and more aggressively sought to gain control of the information space. We saw another surge, and so this is something we'll get into in the report, during the Trump administration, when we saw the criminalization of fake news, and we saw a rise in legal efforts around fake news prosecutions. And then we saw a final push, at least when I was there, I should say, since I've left, the numbers continue to rise, around what we call the COVID crackdown. So the criminalization of health information, essentially. So year after year, what we see is that governments opportunistically embrace legal strategies available to us to justify their repressive action. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to keep track of the time here. So we've talked about this. This is the record number, as I mentioned, 363 journalists in prison around the world. It's really a staggering number. That's us. That's the team I just mentioned. And I think that may be the last time I wore a tie. And also you could see I had a lot more hair, so that's a bit dated. Go back. Okay, let's see. Okay, yes. So this is just a little snapshot into I think did we skip the slide? I'll go back one more.
Oh,
yes, the methodology. Yes, I knew there was something missing there. So let me talk about how we approach the report. So we divided it into 4 phases, and what we wanted to do was to build categories that would allow us to assess the way in which the particular threats were perceived. That was our starting point, and that was the work that Ona Flores carried out, our legal researcher, and she prepared a very detailed analysis of the legal threats, and she actually came up with 14 distinct legal threats and a kind of framework and rationale and definition of those legal threats. And that was our starting point. And then we took those 14 distinct legal threats and we identified a group of 37 global experts on press freedom and media freedom. Most of them had most but not all had a legal background. And we developed a survey and we asked them to classify these different threats and provide input on which they perceived as the most serious and most acute, and some information on why. And then we activated, with the help of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, their incredible network of alumni network of journalists around the world who've participated in various legal support training, various kinds of programming that the Thomson Reuters Foundation does to support journalists and press freedom around the world. That was a sample of 493 journalists, so quite geographically diverse, as we'll see in the next slide. And then we can convene the group of experts to help us identify recommendations, which we'll get to at the end, but we wanted to have at a sufficiently high level that they would be a kind of unifying framework for action among the different communities that I just mentioned. 106 countries, as I mentioned. I'm not going to go through this whole summary, but I want to sort of break this down into a couple categories, really a couple categories, a couple broad points. One is, when we look at the threats, and we'll go through them in a minute, I think they break down into kind of 2 categories. The first is laws that have, are unquestionably legitimate. So defamation laws are legitimate laws. We have no doubt about that. They're a mechanism for accountability, and they are a means through which people who are legitimately defamed can protect their reputations. And we've seen that recently in this country, but they can obviously abused. So the first category is laws that have a legitimate function that are abused. The second category, and this was the category that we were most aware of when I was at CPJ, were laws that that are more often abused or obsolete or have no real legitimate function. Certainly in a democratic society, those can be like sedition laws, sweeping anti-terror laws, espionage laws, anti-subversion laws. And so that's the second category of laws of questionable or dubious legitimacy that are so sweeping that they are really have no legitimate function. And then I just want to call your attention to that last point. I think that's really staggering. 50% of those nearly 500 journalists who participated as journalists in this survey said that they or their media organization were facing legal threats. That is really, I think, one of the most compelling data points, something that we'll discuss in terms of the scope of the legal threats that journalists are facing. Next slide. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm really going to run through the specific threats, and we can talk about them just in the interest of time, because I also want to give Carlos an opportunity. So this was, defamation and insult, as I explained. There was a consensus among the journalists and the experts that this was really perhaps the leading threat, and I think what makes it so such a significant or such a useful strategy for those seeking to suppress critical speech is what we're going to talk about throughout, which is that governments and other enemies of press freedom are seeking, when they use the law, to kind of hide their repressive strategies behind a democratic veneer or a veneer of legitimacy, and defamation is the perfect instrument to do that because of the fact that it is inherently a legitimate legal recourse. Now, this is not something I think that was necessarily that we could confirm through a qualitative research, but it is my observation, after a quarter century kind of in this space, that is why that defamation emerged as a top legal threat. So please, go to the next slide. So one of the things we did, each of the legal threats, we kind of defined it. We looked at the trends, and I had a key expert contribute a kind of a quote or observation that put the whole threat in context. So I'm just going to sort of give you a guide to how we organized the research. Go to the next slide. And we're not going to watch this one. We're going to watch the next one. In each of these particular threats, we embedded a video, an account, about a 1-minute account from a journalist who was, could explain and articulate how they were directly affected by this legal threat. And to me, in terms of the research we did, this was really the most compelling and personally engaging part of this whole exercise, because it really sort of humanized what the experience were like for journalists, and it really gave me a deeper understanding of why this research is so critical. So let's go to the next slide, which is on slaps. You have to go. There we go. So the number 2 threat was slaps. I just want to pause here and say, I'm sure you're all familiar with slaps, and you all understand why they're such a significant threat. I will note, and this is 2 points of discussion that we could consider. One is that there was some disparity in the way that the experts viewed slaps and understood them as a threat. It was definitely really at the top of their list, and the journalists themselves, and that may have to do with the geographic distribution, the fact that many of the experts were kind of more, I'd say they were the northern, the North was overrepresented as opposed to the global South, and the South was more represented in the journalists themselves. So that could be a factor. We don't know, but it's an area of further research. And the other thing I want to point out is we had some discussion, and we engaged with some of the experts on whether slaps were a distinct threat, because it's a tactic, and they often involve defamation claims, but they don't always involve defamation claims. They can involve other legal, other areas of the law that could be abused to achieve the same outcome, which is essentially to tie people in knots and distract them from their work. And rather than telling you about how nefarious slaps are, why don't we hear from Bartosz Walensky, who is you can go ahead and start, who's a journalist with Gazeta Wyborcza in Poland, and will tell you his story right now.
Polish daily Gazeta Wyborcza. Since 2015, we have received more than 100 slaps from the government, from the ruling party, from the chairman of the ruling party, from ministers, party functionaries, state-owned companies, CEOs of those companies. Well, it was a lot. It is really exhausting. It is really time-consuming, money-consuming, but we will not give up. We will still work as a free independent journalist, disclose all the scandals related to this government. We are independent newsroom. We are independent daily. That's why we have been founded.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We'll hear from a few more of these journalists, and if you have time, every one of them I really think is compelling. We don't have to go. Okay, thank you. Okay, so this one, this is one certainly in my CPJ role. I was very aware of this, especially the espionage, which is something that has become a growing threat. I think that this is obviously highlighted by the case of Evan Gershkovich, but this is a charge that we particularly saw in Iran, and the foreign influence has also become an increasingly powerful legal weapon in Russia, for example, where there's the Foreign Agent Registration Act has been used to label and discredit journalists who receive international support. And I want to make one more point. This is something that's going to come up over and over. Is the thing about this many of these legal threats, but particularly something like espionage, treason, and foreign influence, is it's a legal threat, but it invariably triggers online harassment. And it also, so even if you have no success in actually prosecuting this crime, you've achieved something very effective, which is to discredit and undermine the relationship between the media outlet and the public that it serves. So these types of prosecutions often succeed, when they fail. Let's go to the next one. We're just going to go through these because we don't, in the interest of time, you can go through this. This is a very compelling story, but we're not going to hear it now. But I do really recommend, go to the next one. Okay, so this is really again one of the key legal threats I want to point to: cyber libel and other cybercrime provisions. And basically, this is taking defamation and moving it into the digital realm and creating and in most instances using language that's so broadly worded that it criminalizes almost any kind of speech. And this is definitely something that journalists themselves highlighted as a key new concern that they have. And this is one where I think we can run through hearing from Glenda Gloria, who is with Rappler and can really tell the story, which Maria Ressa has highlighted, but it's really important to hear it from Glenda directly about her experience.
Conviction, Maria Ressa and Ray Santos Jr. has really emboldened those in power in the Philippines to use the law to silence independent newsrooms and independent journalists. In fact, after their conviction, we had to face various libel complaints from other political actors too. The climate of fear is palpable, not just in the Rappler newsroom, but in other newsrooms in the Philippines. Because if a court and the executive department could do something to a Maria Ressa, how much more the lesser-known journalists out here? As far as senior management of Rappler is concerned, we also had to refocus our energy from growing journalism, from nurturing the business, to actually defending our case in court, and also our case before the public opinion. because given the lies and the disinformation against independent newsroom and against Rappler, we have had also to focus our attention to responding to these lies and to countering them. This has had tremendous impact on the way we do things, but it has also inspired us to really fight for press freedom and hold the line.
So I just want to add to that, this is something that if you've heard Maria speak, she estimates that she spent 70% of her time fighting the legal cases against her and against Rappler. And if you think about Maria Ressa and the contribution she makes to journalism, that's a tremendous loss to all of us. And it also shows that, again, the purpose of these legal actions is not necessarily to put people in jail, although I do think that's a distinct possibility in Maria's case. But even if that outcome is never achieved, this legal action against Maria and Rappler will have been successful. Again, I mentioned this one, fake news generally, but also related to public health. So this is one that was, definitely weaponized under the Trump administration by opportunistic governments around the world. We had a very compelling speaker in Perugia, in Lina Attila from Mother Masr in Cairo, who's facing these kinds of charges. And her video's here. Again, we're not going to watch it, but you should, if you have a moment, or you can watch, maybe we could put it in the chat. I'll do that after the link to our presentation in Perugia, where we launched the report, and Lina participated. So let's, next one. Tala, I'm sorry, I pronounced her name. Counterterrorism and anti-extremism. Again, I'm going to blow through this one because we talked about it a little bit, and we'll get to the next one because I want to make a particular point about it. So let's keep going. Okay, financial crimes. So even though this is ranked number 7, I want to make I think this is one of the key findings from my perspective, and I think we'll hear from Carlos in a moment. So there are sort of traditional threats. Most of the kind of threats that we've been talking about are not entirely new to us. They, again, they are sort of in different categories. There are, kinds of defamation claims, which are often civil, and slaps and things like that. And then the kind of traditional strategies that governments use to prosecute journalists, the espionage, the sedition laws, the anti-state laws, the anti-terror laws. But this one is incredibly insidious and I think growing. And that is to basically accuse journalists of something unrelated to journalism and to prosecute them for those crimes. And the reason this is such an acute threat is because, and we're going to get to this when we get to the recommendations, the journalists have done a reasonable job. We have a lot more work to do, a huge amount of work to do, but building up the legal infrastructure to support journalists who are facing legal threats. But we're not prepared to defend journalists who are accused of invented crimes that are unrelated to journalism, because it requires a different kind of legal defense, a different kind of legal specialization. They're very expensive and they're very difficult to defend. And they're also deeply damaging for the same reasons that the espionage charges are. To accuse a journalist of these kinds of financial crimes can damage their public standing and reputation. And there's a case that I have a very personal investment in that I want to share with you. So let's go to the video here, and this will be the last one. And this is from Jose Zamora, whose father, Jose Ruben Zamora, is in prison. You can go ahead and start it. Who's in prison in Guatemala, and he's going to explain what that experience has been like.
My name is Jose Zamora. I am a journalist and the son of an imprisoned journalist in Guatemala. His name is Jose Ruben Zamora. He's the founder of El Periódico. Over the years, governments have used different tactics to persecute and silence journalists, from financial boycotts and defamation campaigns to assassination attempts and death threats. In the case of my father, they fabricated a case against him in 72 hours that allowed them to arrest him and to imprison him. They know once they have you in their system, it's very difficult to fight back because they control the entire judiciary, prosecutors and judges. Governments and repressive regimes have identified that criminal law is very effective because they can pursue a journalist, criminalize him, attack his credibility without having to pay the toll of attacking them physically or assassinating them.
So again, one of the reasons this is so insidious and so effective is that it takes place in contexts in which governments control the entire judicial process. So this is a tactic that you see in governments where the independence of the judiciary has been compromised. That's certainly the case in Guatemala, but it's true in many other places around the world. And this is the eighth threat, which again involves sedition, desacato laws in Latin America, lèse majesté laws in countries around the world that protect the monarchy. And again, I think, Carlos, this was actually ranked a little bit higher by the journalists than the experts. So this is another area of exploration that we think we can talk about when we get into that. So let's go to the last bit here where we can skip through this and keep going. We'll get to the recommendations. Okay. Well, these are the additional threats. I mentioned there were 14. We really dove into the top 8 threats, but there are these other ones, and these are all very significant threats which didn't make it into the top tier. But so I just want to remind everyone just how many tools repressive governments have at their disposal. This is an arsenal of weapons that are being deployed against critical journalists around the world. Now let's go to the recommendations, and I'll make one point, and then I think we want to hear briefly from Carlos. Correct? Yeah. Okay. So rather than reading you these recommendations, let me put them into 3 broad categories. The first one is, and again, we tried to make these recommendations with input from the experts at a high enough level that they would really be sort of activated and organizing to the incredible groups that are already involved in these kinds of efforts of defending journalists. But the first one is particularly to governments and particularly to members of the Media Freedom Coalition. It's to stand up and speak out about these threats. Every action to support journalists under threat legally or to support independent media more broadly depends on the perception that this is being undertaken as a matter of principle. And if those principles are not articulated, even when there's some political cost or consequence to doing so, then the credibility of every single other effort is undermined. Point number 1. Point number 2 is provide a broad array of legal support for journalists, and do it in this has to be done in an incredibly creative way. It's Committee to Protect Journalists and Thomson Reuters Foundation and Media Defense have a new undertaking, the NJAR, the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk. That's one example. Reporter Shield is going to be formally announced tomorrow. That's a really important effort to support journalists facing legal threat, particularly slaps. There's some very important and valuable work happening in the space. That's a positive trend that I want to recognize. But legal defense is really, really, really expensive. And if we're going to be serious about confronting this threat, there's going to have to be a lot more resources. And we have to recognize that as soon as we bolster support for slaps, which is totally necessary and essential, governments are very creative, and they're going to see that area shored up, and they're going to find other strategies. So they have to be nimble and adaptable. And the last thing, which I think we're going to talk about today, is this was really exciting, and I'm so grateful to Antonio and the Thomson Reuters Foundation for the opportunity to do this. But I do this research, but I ended up with a lot more questions than I had even when I started. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions that the research exposed, and I hope that that's something we could do today, is talk about those opportunities. So I'll leave it there. It's really exciting to be able to present this to you. I look forward to the discussion, and I want to give Carlos Lauria an opportunity to provide his insight and observations, and also to thank him for his incredible contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel, and thank you again, Antonio, and colleagues of the Thomson Reuters Foundation for all the support that you provided to produce this report. Given my experience, of working as a press freedom advocate and then as a grant maker, working for one of the largest philanthropic foundations on freedom of expression and journalist safety, just want to give a few insights of my how I see these evolving throughout the years in my experience. Shortly after I arrived at CPJ, was November 2002. I was coordinating the Americas program when the Cuban government launched a massive crackdown against political dissidents and journalists, sending 29 journalists in jail and sending in lengthy prison sentences, basically for attacking the interest of the Cuban state. And Joel said during that period, 2002, the legal attacks, the crackdowns against journalists were kind of obvious and were more clear. The enemy of press freedom was clearer. It was anti-state charges was a norm. 2002, I think it was the number of journalists jailed was 120. Today we have tripled that number, a record number of journalists in jail. But I think one of the things that our research discovered is that the journalists jailed is just the tip of the iceberg, and the number of legal attacks is enormous and is very vast, and is affecting journalists everywhere. And the tip of the iceberg, because as Joel said in one of the recommendations, the support and access to legal representations is not readily available for many of the local journalists that are suffering the brunt of these attacks. So I'm going to be brief because I think we want to open it up for questions, but I think that it's clear that one of the probably findings, most notorious findings of the research is the impact that this is having on journalists everywhere, right? I think that 2 decades ago, when I started at CPJ, no one could think that the government of Guatemala could keep a journalist, the most important journalist in the country, founder of the main newspaper, in jail for 9 months, over 9 months, the 29th of April, without, the international community being able to release this journalist. And this is happening, not only in Guatemala, but many parts of the world. So the impact that these threats are having in journalists and journalism everywhere is just not only affecting the sector, journalism sector, it's affecting the ability of citizens to engage in a debate of the main issues affecting societies, and clearly, damaging the health of democracy everywhere. And I think this is probably one of the most impactful findings in the research that we've done you know, in regions across the world. But just to provide some a positive note, so, you know, we don't feel that hopeless in this room, and people that are listening to us, is the fact that, you know, we've also found that there are some positive developments, you know, and in the legal fight against, you know, in the fight against legal attacks. I have here, you know, someone who contributed to the report. Also, I mean, we had the former special rapporteur, or yes, special rapporteur for freedom of expression, and probably some of the most impactful positive outcomes of you know, fight against legal attacks have happened in the Inter-American human rights system, and Edison has worked very hard bringing cases before the system, and he may enlighten us, you know, with some of the examples that, you know, are important in terms of the jurisprudence. And I think, you know, there are also, you know, the anti-SLAPS directives from the EU. I think some of the most positive outcomes come from jurisprudence and legal decisions, and so you know, the portrait is dark, but there's hope. I think I would like to leave it there, and thank you once again, Antonio, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation for this support.
Thank you. So I think it's worth reminding that the report actually lives on a website called medialegalattacks.com. So I don't know if we can drop that into the chat. And there is the report itself. The 8 threats are identified individually, and as Joel was saying, there is a video per threat. So we just wanted to look at different tools to convene the message, and I think the videos themselves actually do a really good job in summarizing each of the threats. From our perspective, the report, as I said earlier, was really needed because we wanted to make a point. We wanted to start documenting these threats. We wanted to make sure that this issue was no longer seen as a niche issue, even within the journalism community, but especially, you know, we wanted this to be understood as a technique and as a tactic by the consumers of news themselves. Because, and I think you touched upon it, Joel, when you were referring to the non-speech related crimes. Yeah. I think a sophisticated reader might understand that a slap or a defamation case might be politically motivated, but it is much more complex to really have the backing of the audience and the general public when financial crimes are an issue that, you know, is brought against the journalists, because we don't manage the finances of those journalists. So, you know, you immediately seed doubt, and you create this, you made the gap of trust between the consumers and the media publisher even wider than what it is right now. And as we know, it's a massive gap. I mean, I was looking again at the Edelman trust barometers. 46% of consumers of news around the world believe that journalists are intrinsically misleading and intentionally misleading the public. So it definitely doesn't help the mission. But I think we wanted to really use this as an opportunity to start the conversation. And as Joel said, there's a lot of more questions that this report actually triggered. And I think one of the data point which we particularly obviously want to continue understand and continue and to dig deep into is the 46% of alumni who indicated that they themselves or their newsroom experienced legal threats. And one of the point of feedback that came from our community was the need for local data and for localized research. So I guess it's a question that I'm posing to the wider audience here is, how would we take that forward? For example, an idea that we are considering is a partnership between an academic institution in the West and academic institutions in the global South or somewhere else in the world. Would that be an idea that you would consider, getting basically feedback on a couple of ideas. So this is one of the first, I guess, questions for the wider audience.
I mean, I can just get that started, and I think we're going to hear from Carlos later about the data. I mean, we did a survey, and it's a sort of perception survey because we don't have data about the number of legal actions at a national level. We don't have comprehensive data. It's depends on the particular country. So collecting that data would be immensely valuable, it seems to me. I mean, it would depend on, obviously, I think would probably have to be done on a national level. And so you'd have to find the right partner. But I think that would give us much deeper insights into this phenomenon, to have those kinds of detailed information, which we currently don't have.
Some contributions from the back.
Okay. Thank you. My name is, and thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you for the report. I'm looking forward to it. My name is Måns Bjerregaard. I am the vice chair of the Danish UNESCO National Commission and also chair of the European Center for Press and Media Freedom. I think it's really important if we can collect all the data, because there are a lot of data out there. The Council of Europe has since 2005 collected data, a lot of data in the sector of safety of journalists, where you can find it really interesting and comprehensive data on each threats. The ECPMF, the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, also collects in the media rapid response mechanism, also collect a lot of data. So I think if we could collect all this together, we really have lots of data. And allow me also to say a few things about SLAPP. One of the very interesting things, the European Commission's initiative on SLAPP is not only that directive, but also the recommendations coming up. Because the recommendations, we can use them immediately. We can ask our governments to change the law accordingly to the recommendations, while the directive takes some years before it's on place. But the recommendation itself, we should really use them. Then I won't take all the time now here, but just say also that I miss one recommendation that I would love so much. Well, the recommendation about collecting our work, legal support for journalists. This is I'm so happy that you reached this. Please could you do this much more, much more. And then the last recommendation I'm missing, and I don't know if anybody have the answer on it. How do we get those journalists out of there? We have journalists in Belarus sitting there, 35 journalists. They are facing when they end the jail of 4 or 5 years, then they just get another 20 years. It's how do we get them out? If we find some mechanisms for that, I would be very, very happy. It's so important to talk about that and find solutions on it. Thank you.
Yes. Okay.
Sure.
What you do there? I get girls out of jail.
I would love to have an answer. But I would
You should say who you are.
I'm sorry. Carlos Martinez de la Serna and
The media, the legal.
I put it in the chat here, so it's medialegalattacks.com. That's the URL where this report is.
So Carlos Martinez de la Serna and the program director of the fund, Carlos and I think that the research is clear. As you said, with many questions, which I think is great, because it's just in widely about but focus on these two things right now. One is the data collection. It's very challenging, and I don't make this point about trying to be comprehensive, which is something we try to do and in this case is quite impossible. So having these cases well illustrated, right now I see like with other issues like online harassment, is the way we can start reading people. But as an idea, I think there's very interesting the partnership here between journalists and legal experts. So maybe that's something we can build in the future. But I would ask also in terms of that data collection. Because Antonio was mentioning the idea of partnering with institutions in different places. I think it's very interesting. I believe one approach, and I want to join this. There are a lot of there's a really solid network of press freedom organizations around the world. Local ones, and obviously the wider scope like CPA and others. Those local ones are in the best position to capture the local impact. In Europe, we have a good example with the platform for the safety of journalism. There are a lot of cases that wouldn't be captured probably and documented that are submitted, and countries ideally need to respond to those cases. But that is a very already good database. You can go back then, there are hundreds of cases that are captured collaboration. And this is like it's not only one organization, but different organizations, sometimes local ones, sometimes CPA, sometimes other. I think like in the Americas, we have both and so. We have people here that have so the growing network of press freedom organizations working collectively to document cases with the same standards and the same laws. That's very similar to CPA, which I have to say that I think that's an inspiration in the way. In the sense like how we monitor and track cases consistently. I think.
Can I ask a question on the consistency?
Might be the platform for the same. So those cases are submitted to a central repository with a systematic way. The later we can approach and tag, and that might be a way of scaling this work.
The consistency is there, right? Because we know we're discussing this earlier, even in if we compare CPJ figures with RSF figures, at times there is a big
being
difference.
comprehensive of this is always going to be a challenge. So even in CPA that we really try to be as comprehensive as possible, we always say at least 70 people. No, we cannot capture. But we're pretty sure about the trends. We're pretty sure that we can compare data, which at the end is something very useful. I think in this terms of the model, I can explore something like that. That can be useful. So these partnerships you already tested here with legal experts.
Thank you.
But there's something else I wanted to ask you.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah,
The
sure.
microphone
And
is-
then I just want to
takes
go
up.
to the back of the room and go
Okay,
to
sure.
two other questions.
Don't want to take more time, but just want to ask something. In the case of justice, you mentioned, right? Guatemala, I know you're personally involved in that case. I am too. If we think about the impact, in the sense, what were the conditions that enabled the government to put Jose Ruben Zamora in jail for such time right now with impunity? We can look at the wider context, in this case, legal context, and the defunding at the dismantling of the International Commission Against Impunity, supported by the UN. So my question is, how much, or whether there's an opportunity for organizations to focus on the wider context that at the end also made new legal attacks against.
Yeah, I mean, look, I know we want to get others involved. So, I mean, Guatemala is a very particular case, but I think the fundamental issue that empowers the state to engage in the kind of action that it has taken against Jose Ruben Zamora in prison is the one that his son Jose identified, which is the complete takeover of the judicial institutions. So it's like Russia. It doesn't look like Russia or China, but it's like Russia and China in the sense that this isn't a legal process at all, with some sort of independent checks and balances. The outcome is a foregone conclusion. All the legal institutions are co-opted by the state, and that is the precondition that allows for these kinds of terrible abuses, and complicates the question that you answered, which is, Belarus. I mean, how do you get journalists out of jail in Belarus? I think if we tackle that, we're not going to be able to get to the rest of the very important questions we have to grapple with today. So
I think we go Pan America. Yeah.
Mine is just a comment. I'm Maria Teresa Garrido from the University for Peace, and we have a project actually providing legal assistance to journalists, and we have been gathering data on the use of legal attacks. So we are just open to collaborate and we already have information from a very specific country. So just to add that to the conversation.
And the team from the Thomson Reuters Foundation here will definitely connect with you at the end. Another question or comment?
I would also just second about the importance of having, or at least knowing what the standards are, taking in information, and that would be both at the reporting part, for example, with the work that CBJ does on reporting on attacks on the press, as well as other parts of their organization and many others, Reporters Without Borders and others, on the emergency assistance support, because those desks within the variety of freedom organizations like the Journalists in Distress Network, or they document who did what to whom, when, where, why, etc., maybe why they're ending, but also very granular. So if it's state, non-state, going down to like the mayor or the name of the commander, or which area in a country, which private company, things like that. So I think that when you're looking at these standards and how information is taken in and how information is tagged, etc., and creating partnerships with lawyers and others, maybe start having conversations with these various groups on the stages and what information they take in, starting at the application or inquiry stage.
And with some of this work, I don't know if you want to interject, is also happening through the Legal Network for Journalists Service. Because we even Trial Watch, for example, is part of that's a complete different story, right? But even Trial Watch, for example, is part of the Legal Network for Journalists Service. I don't know if the team wants to add a little bit more about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that we all started the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk is because of the gaps. Because also we saw that like longer term lawsuits and things like that many years ago. We're like, who's covering that? If we can cover 6 months, or others can cover 12 months, and then somebody's literally walking out the door of a prison and they've got 5 more cases, so that they can even leave or boarding slap suits.
Thank you. I think there is another comment from the back. Can you just Can you just say who you are?
Hey, my name is Itai. I'm a professor of human rights at John Jay College, and I wanted to perhaps when you said about the use of procedure to offer a term, it's rule by law as opposed to rule of law. So they rule by law as opposed to rule of law. Thank you.
Antonio, I think Edison Lanza, a former rapporteur, would like to say something about the positive developments.
Please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and congratulations for this amazing report. It's so useful. Like Carlos Auria said, Latin America, we have two, pictures. In countries that take the way for authoritarianism, like Nicaragua, Guatemala, Cuba, Venezuela, well, all the standards are, to West, because the government don't have independence of the judiciary, take the control of the judiciary, and this kind of threats, like Rubén Zamora in Guatemala, it's impossible to fight with the international standards. But in the rest of the countries, in the democratic countries, we have in the last 10 years many steps to decriminalize defamation, desacato, and other figures, criminal figures. And also the Inter-American Human Rights Court ruling in the last 5 cases that maintain criminal law like defamation is against of the American Convention of Human Rights. This is the first time in the history, because in the previous cases, the court rules case by case. If in this case, it's a disproportionality and so on. But in the last 5 cases, like the European Human Rights Court, the Inter-American Court said, well, the countries that maintain this kind of law in the penal codes are against the convention. And with UNESCO, we have a systematization of all of the cases. This book we published the last year, and it's available for all to take note of for these advances.
Thank you.
Can I just make one follow-up comment from Edison and Carlos as well? I mean, one of the things that, when I was working with Holly and Catalina and the team at, Columbia Global Freedom of Expression during the years spent here at Columbia, we were constantly noting the, very positive jurisprudence emerging in various forums, and the discrepancy between the jurisprudence and the experience that journalists have, that's something that I think, how do we bridge that gap? That's kind of the legal challenge. How do we make these legal decisions, there are so many, I think Carlos is right, that I think the inter-American system, the commission has been, in the last decade, certainly, there have been tremendously positive rulings. But if you look at the experience on the ground, for most journalists in Latin America, the legal environment has deteriorated. So, how do we reconcile?
No, of course, the next steps is that each country, reform the law. We have only 3 or 4 examples with the best practice in this sense, like Uruguay, Argentina, Mexico, and I think it's that country, reform the law in the sense to decriminalize in express way in the law. In the other countries like Chile, Peru, Brazil, Colombia, the law is maintain the figures, and time by time some politician or public figures use this for attack the press. Then I think that is important to advocacy for comply with the decision of the Inter-American Court, and the Congress passed a law to reform. And in the countries like Argentina, Uruguay, Panama, the slap threats is now a reality, because when you decriminalize, if you not reform the civil law, many these cases move to the civil courts.
Right. I think that's a perfect segue, because I want you to bring in Chan Yeginsu from the High Level Legal Panel, which is part of the Media Freedom Coalition. And John, you do this, with your High Level Legal Panel hat, often talking to governments, giving recommendations to governments. So some comments on what we just said about changing the law. And then I wanted to ask a question, which kind of stems from a comment that I heard in the room. I don't remember who made it, but it was around how can we, I think it was Carlos who said, how can we use then the power of the law at an international global level to potentially even sanction countries that are clearly abusing the rule of law to abuse, to silence journalists.
Gosh, 2 questions, Antonio. Very nice to be here, and I'm sorry I am late. I came straight from the panel meeting at the UN, and we were talking about these issues. I want to just start with a proposition that Joel made, and then answer your 2 questions through that. So Joel's absolutely right. I mean, lawyers are obviously not the answer. Often they're the problem. The fact that, for example, some of the decisions that Special Rapporteur just referred to, one of them is the El Universo case, right? These are very positive, but they do not equal to things are getting better in those jurisdictions or in those regions. I would reverse it a little bit in that if you have, and of course, justice is very slow when international law, you need to go through exhaust domestic remedies. The commission has to look at it, then it goes to the court. Right. We're talking about 8 years, 9 years before you get to that decision. But if the court rules, actually, when it comes to criminal defamation, we're now querying as a court whether or not these sorts of laws can even exist anymore. Then that means that individual states have to think, okay, right, we've now hit against a bit of a ceiling as to what we can do with these defamation laws that should never be there. So the very worst, even if they don't amend out the laws, they ought, as rational actors, to be deploying them less frequently. The problem is that it takes so long to get to the Inter-American Court. But of course, you look at the African courts, right?
Yeah.
The Farge case against the Gambia, etc. To be able to go to a court without exhausting domestic remedies and to be told, actually, you know, these criminal defamation laws, they are not fit for purpose anymore. You need to change them. The country then has to change them. It's a very powerful tool, but of course, it's not enough to keep journalists safe. In terms of what you can do with the law, so reverse lawfare, one thing I think is interesting, it doesn't work for countries with national resources. You know, Russia can sell its oil and gas. The Gulf countries will always have buyers.
China.
But China is exactly the beating heart of capitalism. But there are many countries where actually the economy matters. So if you say that, okay, I'm going to prosecute journalists by reference to these financial crimes, right? You know, they've dodged something on tax, or actually, you know, they didn't fill out this form properly, etc. And rather than sort of locking them up on conventional criminal bases, what you're doing is you're finding these quite complex and nuanced ways that people don't really understand. I don't mean people in this room, I just mean generally. I mean, tax fraud's tax fraud, right? No one's going to look into whether or not what they've tried with Maria Ressa, right? But what's interesting there, and actually the Philippines is quite an interesting one. Philippines needs its allies and it needs foreign direct investment, right? President Marcos now is looking at FDI having gone down by a half, right? Because of Duterte, right? He cannot afford for that to continue. So investors are all given special protections in law. So if investors are giving special protections in law, how does that work? It works through treaties, right? It's international law. It's not the ICCPR, it's not the European Convention, etc., but it's international law. It's state-governed law. So if all of a sudden countries start saying, hang on a minute, Philippines or another country, you start doing these, we're just not either going to enter into these treaties with you, or we're not going to trade on favorable terms, which is what the EU is now working on. That really does focus minds.
And is it happening?
It is happening. It is happening. A lot of countries are being, I mean, the EU's got its own mechanism, right, on who it does trade with, what ratings they have, and human rights, freedom of expression. It's a relevant consideration. So rather than just seeing these worlds as, you know, trade is over here, investment is over here, and human rights is over here, well, international law governs all of it. So when we go to states now, we say you've got to take a holistic view, right? Yes, the Inter-American Court is very important. The European Court is very important. It's not enough, right? This has got to be a part of your relationship on a state-to-state level. And viewed that way, these are quite powerful tools that can be deployed.
Should there be a new mechanism to unify that, or is the existing?
It sort of exists. It's just, it feels like a different language to a lot of it. I genuinely think it's more of a Tower of Babel. And it's even on the lawyers, right? I'm obviously speaking as a lawyer. Even the lawyers who operate in one area don't operate in another. So rights lawyers don't really operate in the world of trade and investment. But what we're doing as the high-level panel is when we're going to states, of course, we're saying, you know, 1,800 emergency visas in 2022 for journalist arrest. That's got to go up to 4,000, right? All of the conventional routes that the states can take to assist. But actually, think about the non-conventional. When you are speaking to Singapore about a trade agreement, right? People in that room need not just to look at, you know, food standards. They need to look at human rights standards. I think it's very powerful.
Is there a role then for even the business community to be played in a more coordinated fashion? Because I mean, this strategy has been really effective when it comes, for example, to LGBT rights across a lot of African countries, where businesses who had the purpose and a mission were actually lobbying and saying, well, I'm not going to open my factory in Kenya or my
Yeah.
operations in Kenya because I can deploy talent globally and internationally.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether there is a role for business to be played here.
Couldn't agree more. Antonio, I couldn't agree more. And in big investors. So when you look at these multinationals, think, well, actually, you need to have departments within the company saying, well, if I've got a choice between three, and it's all the same lending criteria or investment protections or incentives, then I'm actually going to go, I've got a state policy or a company policy to go for the one that looks at rights and freedom of expression. And, you know, for the media, this is really important because we're entering into a phase where countries have got to grapple with the issue of foreign ownership and foreign investment at the same time, right? They can no longer just say, oh, it's all banned, you're all foreign agents, etc. You will have noticed on the foreign agents laws outside of Russia and some of the entrenched jurisdictions, some governments have tried and they've massively rowed back because of the investment consequences, right? Think about what Poland was going to do with the Disney's investment in the media there. Massively rowed back because it's too expensive. It's too expensive to go after the independent media if you frame it like that.
Thank you, Jonathan. How about you wanted to?
Yeah, so on that, I think that's brilliant. And I also thought ESG.
Can you identify yourself?
So my name is Heba Kandil. I work at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, part of the Media Freedom team. And we're very, very happy. And we wanted to make sure that part of this monumental research that was done, that we made sure that the voices at the front lines, the actual journalists being affected, their voices not only were captured, but helped shape any kind of solution that comes out of this. And so I wanted to pose a question to Jan. This is really interesting. So what kind of data, what data and research you think is needed at a more specific level to empower this model that you were talking about?
I think even before one goes to the data, one needs to have a common language and get people who don't necessarily think about these issues in this way to come together. Then when on the money, it's quite easy on the money, and because investment flows attract every year, and these sorts of things, I mean, they lead to governments having to change, right? I mean, there's many open economies that have, you know, good times and bad times when it comes to human rights. What they cannot deal with is investors, and I mean institutional investors. I don't mean dodgy money coming in, because dodgy money coming in can be taken out very quickly. Institutional investors, they start leaving, then government might not be able to come in for a second term. So one has got to look at, and the Philippines is, and I just had Maria on my mind, but Philippines is a great example. I mean, it needs not only the, you know, military strategic alliance with China, etc. It just needs investment, right? I mean, Vietnam needs investment. Vietnam's getting a lot of investment. What we're going to see, though, interestingly, is China coming in and saying, we'll invest. But what China, the mistake that China made in Africa is that it invested in very expensive ways. So it said, oh, we'll give you some money. But it was very expensive money. And then when the countries couldn't pay back, I mean, they just looked like terrible money lenders rather than countries that were investing properly in a country's development. So data for me on the international economic angle is all about inflows and who is investing. And then on the media freedom data, I mean, look at the laws that are being passed, right? Look at the targeting of journalists. I mean, these are very basic. This is all what the report is talking about. We know what our metrics are for media freedom, but it's also media plurality. You all know the word. It's been a very long day, but it is, because if actually is saying, well, you know, we're not touching journalists, but you look at the media and it's really changed hands because of some of these legal cases, the big tax cases, right, where the government says, Antonio, you owe us 8 billion in tax. Oh, we can make it go away so long as you just shift company over to to Joel, because we know that Joel will cover us in the right way. It's all done sotto voce, right? And then you don't need to lock any journalists up. So you've got to look at the way in which who is there, are foreign journalists allowed in, etc. All of those things.
And which type of weaponized laws.
Of course.
So, yeah, exactly.
Of course. The odd thing is, the judicial, the prosecutorial, I think that's quite old fashioned now. I think we're going to see much more nuanced interferences with media freedom than, bent judiciary, bent prosecution, just saying, you're a criminal, journalism is. I think it's going to get more sophisticated. And I think the Zamora case is a good example of using financial crimes, Maria's case with tax crimes. People just switch off. The narrative is much, much harder.
Licensing, copyright.
Yeah, of course, all of those things.
I think there's another comment. Was there a comment from the back of the room earlier? Yes.
Yes, might have been me, I think, yeah. So my name is Camelia Nistor. I'm a university lecturer in Brussels and Romania. And I also used to work in these EU institutions. I have the feeling that someone here, you may have also worked for the Commission.
Yeah.
Yes, I also worked for the Commission, for the Parliament myself. And so first, I would like to say that I could certainly very easily, let's say, see this kind of an event taking place in the premises of the Parliament. We oftentimes have such, this kind of a, if you want, gathering and chats on such more than pertinent topics, certainly. And maybe even more given the fact that more and more attention is being offered to put on this media literacy related, let's say, initiatives, activities, and so on, I would consider that bringing this message here to students, to different categories of people, can be decision makers, like you said, academia, in general, students included. And I say it's also as a professor, I consider this is absolutely crucial in terms of raising awareness. Our students should understand, younger generations should understand very well, have a very clear picture of how this really works on the ground, so to say. And more than that, I would also have a quick question here for you. What would you consider might be a good way, or I don't know, some good ways in which the very dialogue between media people and decision makers could be improved? In terms even of, why not, shaping together legislation. By the way, I have a PhD on EU lobbying. And in my thesis, at some point, I even insisted on the fact that lobbying should not be just reactive, like oftentimes you see it happening in Europe at least, but rather preventive, in the sense that you, as a lobbyist, you're not just going to wait for legislators to really, come with some legislative proposal, and only that would be the moment for you to react, but rather you might be willing to develop a more proactive stand. Exactly. Develop this anticipative thinking, proactive, preventive thinking. More or less the same here. I see it, you see the same. So this kind of a dialogue, this is what I'm trying to underline between you here, media people and decision makers, I think could really make sense. And again, I personally am absolutely impressed with what you have done here as a, as a team. My congratulations. This is so much, not just interesting, but I think so much needed, especially in these delicate times that we are currently, facing with this digitalization getting stronger and stronger, this AI and fake news, misinformation, disinformation. And again, we all know that in this academic world, we put more and more emphasis on media literacy. We want for people to understand, to educate people about the role, the impact of media, and even the consequences of not being aware of such things. Sometimes those consequences might be pretty tough.
So very quickly on and I think I want to hear also from Joel on this point, but on the presenting the report to your students, we're more than happy, either Joel or my team, we will, if you want for that to happen. One of the ideas of gathering here is that we really want to take this report as far as possible, because to your point, journalists don't really understand these risks, and we know because we've spoken to many of them. So we want to familiarize this report to as many audiences as possible. We don't do at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we don't conduct advocacy. However, we empower advocacy organizations with legal tools, for example, legal research. And my team can maybe can speak to some of the research that we've done and how this is actually a very powerful mechanism, to your point about advocacy and proactive advocacy, to try to shape policy.
Exactly. It's what I had in mind. Exactly.
I don't know if you want to jump in on some of the work that we've done.
Sure. Well, why don't I start, and then Elise, if you want to jump in afterwards. So in terms of sort of legal tools at the foundation.
Can you identify yourself?
Sorry. I'm Joanne Sawyer. I'm head of special projects at Thomson Reuters Foundation, specifically within trust law. The aim of trust law is to facilitate free legal support, advice and research support for social enterprises and non-governmental organisations. And as part of that work, we work jointly with organisations like CPJ, like Media Defence, like many other media freedom and other organisations to develop legal tools which really facilitate and promote the advocacy objectives of the organisations themselves. So to give you a couple of examples in this space, and then please feel free to jump in and tell me about all the ones I've missed. But we develop, for example, Know Your Rights guides, which relate to journalists and the ability that the rights and responsibilities that they have when covering protests, and we've identified specific regions or specific jurisdictions where there are hotspots. For example, in the US, in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement, more recently in India, so that journalists who are involved in covering protests understand the rights that they have when doing so, and then what the police and other authorities can also legitimately do within that context. If you want to speak to a couple of other pieces of research that you facilitate.
So another great example is touching on the legal threats. That one of them is about fake news. So we recently worked with the Committee to Protect Journalists on understanding the fake news legislation in Russia. And again, the kind of purpose is equipping journalists to know their rights and the scope of that legislative tool. We're also currently about to start working with Article 19 and Media Defence on a comparative analysis of anti-SLAPP legislation. So that's possibly an example where we're trying to be preemptive. So not just relying upon some reactive legislation, but during horizon scanning, identifying that there's a lot of fantastic work happening in the EU, for example, and wanting to expand that to look at the Latin American and African context as well. But would love to connect afterwards and perhaps we can explore more opportunities.
Thank you. Comment on your face off.
Of course, I'm Ivor Shapiro from the Canadian Centre for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University. Yeah, I have a question, and I think depending on the answer, maybe a comment. But the question probably is more important. Great, the report is amazing. Of course, I've looked through it very quickly, and congratulations to you all. Remarkably important work. The one thing I do notice, and I don't know if this is just me not looking carefully, is that it seems to me that almost all of the examples in the report are from countries that are either not constitutional democracies at all, or countries that have alleged constitutional democratic frameworks, but are in fact authoritarian in practice. And that makes me wonder, am I perhaps missing something about focus? That's just because I'm new here. Or is that something that you have thoughts about? Certainly, of course, there are legal threats to press freedom in many constitutional democracies today, and they are increasing. So, and I know you know that. So I'm wondering what I might be missing there, and what comment you would make about that.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, when you look at the range of threats, there are some of those threats, probably a relative handful, that are going to be the kind of active legal concerns in countries that have stronger democratic institutions. So you're not going to see generally like anti-state laws or prosecution under sedition laws or something of that nature. So that sort of means that the examples sort of skew towards countries, when you're looking at the array of threats and the full gamut, you're going to skew towards countries that tend to be a bit more repressive. And then, I mean, I beyond that comment I would make, but beyond that, we try to, in sort of identifying examples, really we did sort of emphasize particular narratives that we thought were compelling. And so we wanted to showcase the way in which these threats were manifest. And so that might have skewed some of the presentations towards journalists working in places where there's a higher level of state repression.
If I may, sorry, I didn't mean to, but I just wanted to say I might have a thought to offer on that.
Perhaps I can just build on your question and your reply. So people have already mentioned here the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk. And interestingly, in the first year in which the Legal Network has been operational, we've seen requests for assistance coming not just from countries that you're talking about, but also very much that the UK and the US is a focus point in litigation against journalists. And so, I guess the requests that we've seen for assistance aren't bearing out at this point, although we accept, of course, that the threats arise globally and in particular hotspot jurisdictions. But in terms of the requests that we're seeing currently, they're also focused on those, countries like the UK and the US, which are real hotspots for litigation.
And the UK is mentioned because of the national security law that has been released by the House of Lords right now. There's a specific point in the report that mentions that.
If I may add, Antonio, if you see SLAPs,
exactly.
For example, SLAPs, are predominant in Europe, and we have highlighted that in the report.
Concern that I have is twofold. One is, I think the rising legislation, online harms, anti-disinformation laws. This is, I doubt that we would associate that with the usual suspects necessarily in terms of arising, what you were saying about proactive advocacy. That seems to be a kind of missing concerns. Also, your number one threat, of course, abuse of defamation, very much a threat in some constitutional defamation.
Absolutely.
But the sort of more, I guess, concern that I have in terms of communication generally, and I would say this also about the Media Freedom Coalitions, for example, if I may, is that it is possible to look at this from outside of the spectrum of the global Northwest, let us say, and say, these are largely people saying, we have it right in our countries, and you guys need to get this right the way we have got it right. And I doubt that that is an intentional message on anybody's part, but it certainly feels, and it's a concern that I've heard about the rhetoric involved in these matters. So I'm just offering that thought.
John,
Yes, I was just going to come back. I mean, obviously, as the high level panel, we're independent of the states that make up the Media Freedom Coalition. I smirked because it seems like 80-90% of the time is actually telling those states what they're not doing right. And that although, the laziest answer always is, you go to the United States, oh, we've got the First Amendment, full stop. Most of the work, of course, you hear the Media Freedom Coalition make statements in relation to things that are going on globally. But if you actually look at the substance of the work, it's all about trying to shore up the countries that are taking on leadership positions. So rather than say, isn't Canada great? I'm saying, well, actually, Canada thinks it's great, but what about this? What about that? And a lot of those conversations are had privately, but they do then lead to legal reform, practice reform, money being funneled into good projects, etc. But I take the broader point, which is it's quite easy, and I don't think it's one that applies to the report, but it is quite easy to, open these conferences and point fingers at 3 or 4 countries all the time, which I think is not what's being done here. And I think the United Kingdom is going to be interesting for the next couple of years.
Thank you, John. We're really up for time. So if we can take 2 quick comments, one from here and one from Carlos, it's probably really up for time. Please go ahead.
I'm Kavita Chandran. I'm a
journalism trainer with TRF. I sit in Singapore and I train a lot of journalists in remote parts of Asia. And I know for a fact that this is a great report. And I know for a fact if I take this report to all the trainees, one of the first questions is going to be, what do I do if I get arrested? So you're talking about people who are on the ground, who are affected. Some of them are very young, very gung-ho to go dive into protests and do stories, etc. And I'm hoping and wishing that there will be a compendium of resources for journalists who, if it's a hotline or, just piggybacking on what Heba said about solutions, where do I go if I get into trouble? Who are the people who are trying to fix this for me? So if there is some answer that as a journalism trainer, I can take to journalists who are really, these are guys in Kashmir and Mindanao and, Sri Lanka who really want to do their great jobs, but if something goes wrong, what do they do? So it would be good to have some sort of a resource bank.
I would just say, send them to medialegalhelp.org, which is the legal network for journalists at risk. And that's an entry point into a wider ecosystem, which means that we really should be putting it at the back of every single training course that we deploy. And finally, Carlos, you wanted to.
Thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to make a comment. I think
Maybe come, if you could sit over there because the mic's not working, right, that spot.
I think Tan's comments on reverse lawfare are very interesting, and it's something we've been looking into from the advocacy perspective. I just want to highlight one thing, which is that politics matter, and it's a big obstacle. So political context and political opportunity. So in the Philippines, we might see there's an opportunity because Marcos Jr., certain circumstances, but we don't see that in Morocco. It has very deep ties with the EU. And CPA's recent report on the European Union perfectly shows that, like, national interests, national agendas matter. So I think it's very interesting to focus on the reverse lawfare, but we need to, I think, consider that governments need to be held accountable. And not only the ones that are clearly openly breaking laws or weaponizing the law against journalism, but those who are willing to maintain the same level of ties with those governments. And we see that all the time. So I think that's an important message to all those countries that are allegedly respecting or protecting press freedom, but they aren't, because they're doing business with Hong Kong when Jimmy Lai is or with Guatemala, perhaps because of Rubén Zamora, many other cases.
Thank you, Carlos. I think we are for time. I hand it over to you, Haley, to close, or.
Well, I'd just like to thank everybody so much for coming today. It's been a really fascinating, in-depth conversation. So I'm grateful for all the contributions, and the video will be posted online. So anybody who would like to review that later, it's going to be available up on YouTube. So with that, I think, thank you very, very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Couple questions online.